Hi there and welcome back to the channel. This will be the first of, I hope, many tank reviews here. I'll start out by giving you a bit of background about the tank historically before talking about its statistics in-game. I'll follow that up with some gameplay in the vehicle, talking about how you can convert the tactics used by the player into your games when necessary if you find yourself playing this tank or others like it. All that over with, let's start with the review of this, the M4 Sherman. First designed in 1940, the M4 was named after the American Civil War General William T. Sherman. It entered service in 1942, and in the space of 3.5 years, the Yanks cranked out about 50,000 of these things, the same as building one every 40 minutes. The Americans surprisingly only used about half of these themselves. The Lend-Lease program meant that Britain had almost half of all of the Shermans produced, which in turn went to other Allied factions. The Soviets got about 4,000 and a few others went elsewhere. For a tank, the Sherman was fairly cheap. It cost $45,000 to $65,000 per unit back then, which is about $600,000 to $900,000 in today's money. The final cost depended on the variant being made, of which there were not that many. The idea was to have a cheap, reliable tank that had minimal variants in order to standardize parts and keep supplies running across the Atlantic and other places. After World War II, the US moved on to the Patton variants in 1957. However, the Sherman saw service right up until the 1980s in Israel. As you'd expect, it was becoming a little bit undergunned at that point. Instead of Panzer IIIs and IVs, it would be coming up against T-34-85s and IS-3s. All kind of factions that ordered M4s made their own modifications. The most notable one is attaching the massive 105mm cannon at one point. This is a variant that's also available in-game as a premium. The final serving Shermans in the world were retired from the Paraguayan military service when? 5 years ago, in 2018, nearly 80 years after it entered service for the Americans. Basically, if there was a major tank battle in the past century or so, chances are some of these things would have been trundling about in it. This is the second most produced tank of all time across all nations. I'll leave it to the comments for the number one spot, but I'll give you a clue and tell you right now that it isn't the Tiger that's number one. If there were more Tiger tanks than Shermans, you'd probably be watching this tank review in German. Anyway, let's move on to the stats. I'm going to start with the stats you can't change but are still worth knowing. All in all, the Sherman was 9 to 10 feet tall depending on the variant, so they were quite tall things. The reason I'm telling you this is for the purpose of camouflage, which I'll talk about later. For now, let's just say it's a disadvantage for Sherman drivers in that respect. The tank has a fantastic 12 degrees of gun depression. This makes it very flexible on ridge lines and does work to counteract the height of the thing. Its armour is fairly decent, but cannot be expected to reliably bounce shots from enemies. The entire front of the hull is 50.8mm thick. The upper glacis starts at an angle of 44 degrees and then slopes back to almost 60 degrees as it reaches near the turret. Because of this sloping, the effective armour of the tank is significantly higher than 50.8mm. It ranges from 65mm to almost 100, and that's just on flat ground. If you can use your gun depression, you dramatically increase the effective armour of the tank to the point where you have a reasonable chance of bouncing standard ammunition from equal tier tanks. If you use all 12 degrees of your gun depression, the minimum effective armour you have is 80mm. This number increases as the shape of the tank slopes back towards the turret, topping out at a respectable 145mm of effective armour, nearly triple the actual plate thickness. Even if you only use half of your gun depression on a ridge, you're essentially bolting on an extra 10mm armour plate to the frontal hull. That being said, unfortunately you don't really stand a chance against premium ammunition. Almost all of the tanks at tier 5 have premium penetration values that exceed your maximum effective armour by a large amount. So if they're firing it at you and hit, it's probably going in. To bring home the effectiveness of angling, the upper glacis of the Sherman does have a machine gun port in the model, but the armour on that is thicker than the glacis plate by about 10mm. However, even on flat ground, you have a far better chance of penetrating that gun port than the upper glacis itself because it's presenting a much flatter surface. The lower plate on the Sherman is a large weak spot, unfortunately. It is also 50.8mm thick, but it's flat. This means you're getting penned by pretty much every single gun you could possibly face with standard ammo, and there's nothing you can do about it. I would definitely suggest hiding this plate if you can for this reason. Again, the Sherman isn't exactly petite, so a piece of cover that hides the lower plates of other tanks might not fully hide this one. Moving on to the turret, there is some good news. The mantlet of the gun, this area here, quite large, is essentially 90mm of spaced armour covering a 25mm plate. So it's unlikely that it gets penetrated by equal tier tanks, even with premium ammo. Above that, at the top of the tank, the armour is 44.5mm thick and extremely well angled, even on flat ground. What this means is that it can't be penetrated by any gun, including tier 7s. The exception to this rule are tanks that can overmatch the plate and ones that fire a certain premium ammunition type. The overmatch mechanic probably deserves its own video, so the short version is, if the penetration angle is more than 70 degrees, the shell will always ricochet. This rule is always ignored, however, by tanks that have a gun whose caliber is triple the base armour thickness. So in this case, guns of caliber 134.5mm or more. You can't ricochet those shells, and it's down to the penetration RNG to determine whether they do damage. But don't worry, there aren't any tanks that have a gun that big at tier 7 or less. A point of note, tanks that fire high explosive anti-tank rounds, this premium round, or this auto ricochet angle increases to 80 degrees. The rest of the turret is 63.5mm thick all the way around. Again, due to the shape and angling of the turret, the effective armour is roughly 80 to 100mm thick. Not enough to reliably bounce many of the guns at tier 5, but still relevant against tier 4s. As you'll see later on though, the Sherman's turret does turn quite fast, so you may get a lucky ricochet every so often. You may knowingly or unknowingly turn the turret, increase the angle to the point of auto ricochet, and enemy fires and bounces. You can't really rely on this happening, but the game is RNG based, so it's possible. In terms of relevant armour, that's where the story ends for the Sherman. Each side and the rear is completely flat and is 38.1mm thick. This means, unless they hit that magical 70-degree penetration angle and have a gun caliber of 114.3mm or less, you're not bouncing anything really. The absolute maximum effective armour you can present is only 90mm thick, which is far less than equal tier tanks' average standard penetration. You'll have to watch for tanks getting above you, as the engine deck of the Sherman is only 12.7mm thick, a guaranteed penetration for any tank that you face. This armour is also thin enough to be penetrated by equal tier artillery shells, resulting in a quick game for you. The Sherman has quite a large commander's hatch, and it's only 38mm thick all the way around. This means it's going to be penetrated by everything that hits it pretty much. However, it's not an easy target to hit. As mentioned, the Sherman is a tall machine, so even on flat ground, chances are your enemies will be shooting up at it if they want to hit it. As such, the hatch will be partially covered by the turret itself and a smaller target to hit. In summary then, the Sherman's armour profile isn't bad, but I think it falls short of being relied on to ricochet shells in the game. You'll get some lucky ricochets, but it will be difficult to regularly engineer a situation such that the enemy won't be able to penetrate you. That being said, you can make yourself a difficult target, especially tanks of equal tier, by using that fantastic 12 degrees of gun depression and only exposing your reasonably well armoured turret to poke over ridges. Alright. Now we move on to the more changeable stats. These are the base stats of the vehicle when it contains a fully trained crew and has the highest researchable modules. For the sake of simplicity, the effects of equipment won't be here, but I'll make a couple of suggestions based on what the tank is good at and what you're trying to accomplish. To see where the Sherman stands, I've compared its stats to every other tier 5 medium in the game to see where it stacks up against the tanks you're most likely to come up against in your games. I've not included stats like the radio range of the tank in this review because I think they are of little importance. As of this recording at least, I understand Wargaming have hinted at changing the commander skill system for the PC version, but I'm not going to wait for them. First up is the total hit points of the tank. In recent years, the PC edition of World of Tanks buffed all of the hit point pools of tanks tier 6 and below. As far as I can tell, the World of Tanks Blitz mobile version has followed suit. They don't appear to have a wiki or tank database I can use to confirm this, and I refuse to check on the app itself, so I could be wrong. This is definitely not the case, however, for the console edition of the game. The tank still has a significantly lower hit point pool. In the PC and mobile edition, the Sherman has 600 hit points, while the console edition, the total is 460. The Sherman has only 10 more hit points in both cases than the lowest health medium tanks at tier 5. Moving on to view range, this is identical over all editions, and the Sherman comes joint top with 370 meters view range base, a full 20 meters above the average. This is obviously one of its greatest strengths and a good candidate for investing equipment into and commander skills to boost it even further above the rest. The top speed of the vehicle was about the average, 48 kilometers an hour forwards and 18 kilometers an hour backwards. The story is the same for the power to weight ratio, predictably, just over 16 horsepower per ton, so it's not particularly quick to accelerate or when it tops out, but it is by no means slow. It can turn a gun round pretty quick if you use the tracks. The tracks and the turret both turn at just over 38 degrees per second, so you can get a full rotation off in pretty much 4 seconds. The camouflage values for the Sherman are slightly below average. While stationary, the base value is 12.57, and while moving, it's 9.4. What this essentially means is other unmodified mediums will be spotting you at about 320 meters while you're moving with no cover. Obviously, other players will have commander skills and equipment that improves their view range, so that is not always true, and you'll face light tanks in your games which have higher base values. That being said, you can use your excellent view range to outspot opponents. I would suggest you use dense bushes if you want to fire. The base camouflage rating drops to less than 3 when you fire your gun. If you recall, I said the height of the Sherman was a disadvantage in this game. That's because the way the game determines if you're spotted or not is by checking the distance between the spot point of enemy tanks, such as commander's hatches and gun sights, and certain vision points on your tank. One of these points on your tank is always at the top, and the Sherman can be taller than some bushes. So you might think you're hidden behind one, but someone comes along, the server checks the distance, the rest of the points are receiving the camo bonus from the bush, but the top one isn't because the view isn't obstructed by the bush, it's far above it, and you get spotted while behind cover because you're relying on the base values of the tank, which aren't that great. Now we move on to weaponry. Speaking of guns, there are 2 competitive options for the Sherman in World of Tanks. The first you can research is the 105mm howitzer. The short version of this gun's stats is that it's one of the worst howitzers you can fit at tier 5. It's outperformed by other howitzers mounted on other mediums, let alone other tank destroyers, in every aspect. Starting with accuracy, dispersion at 100 meters is 0.55 and the aim time is 2.4 seconds. The accuracy is predictably worse than the average by quite a large margin, but the aim time isn't too far off, with most tanks aiming about 0.2 seconds quicker. Then we move on to damage output. Now, the base value assigned to this is ridiculously high because of the nature of the gun. It deals 410 damage per shot, or 350 with premium, and that's nearly quadruple the damage of the standard 57 and 76mm cannon at this tier, and it reloads nearly as quick. This is of course balanced by the very poor penetration of the howitzer. This is the case for all howitzers at this tier, by the way. They all penetrate at about 50mm of armour with standard ammunition and just over 100mm with premium ammunition. The idea is you fire the standard ammo, known as high explosive or HE, at your target, and it explodes without penetrating, dealing splash damage to the target. It's here I must mention some discrepancies between the editions of the game though. The PC edition recently implemented changes to HE shells. This was to combat the effect of artillery, which primarily fire much bigger HE shells, but tanks that use howitzers like the Sherman were caught in the crossfire. Without getting into the details, in the PC edition, howitzers do less damage and have a smaller blast radius. This isn't the case in the console edition again. The HE shells have essentially remained the same since they entered the game. For those of you who only play PC, the artillery on the console edition of World of Tanks is still like it was when it entered the game. There's no stun mechanic, it's just huge damage and splash radius, as of this recording at least. Anyway, in terms of the Sherman, you can comfortably do about 100 splash damage per shot, even to tier 7 heavy tanks from the front in the console edition. The alternative option for the Sherman is a 76mm cannon. The aim time of this gun is a little bit quicker at 2.3 seconds, and the accuracy is predictably better than the howitzer, but it is still a little bit below average at 0.43 meters dispersion at 100 meters. The penetration is the same across all editions, but damage output is where another disparity occurs. The same gun in the same tank in the same game fires at different speeds across all platforms. You'd think that the damage per minute would be higher in the PC version because of the higher hit point pools, but the opposite is the case. The damage per minute of the Sherman is just over 200 hit points higher in the console edition, the one with diminished hit points, than it is the PC edition. The same gun fires 0.6 seconds faster. Anyway, the PC version of the gun fires slower than the average, while the console version of the gun fires quicker than their respective average. One advantage the 76mm cannon has is that it can penetrate armor plates of 25mm or more regardless of angle or distance due to the overmatch mechanic. A calculation made by the game is that if the caliber, not the penetration value, of the gun is more than triple the raw armor thickness, it will always penetrate with armor-piercing shells. It's a niche but not insignificant advantage over many of the other Tier 5 mediums in this case, because the standard armament for them at this tier is a 75mm cannon of some iteration, which will not overmatch 25mm plates. It must be more than triple. I'm not going to tell you the location of 25mm plates on every Tier 5 tank, because, quite frankly, I don't know, and I don't think it's worth memorizing such a large amount of information for relatively little gain. The benefit of this is you'll get some lucky damaging shots off even if you hit a thin plate, such as the engine deck or the top of the tank. Okay, so that is all the statistics of the Sherman covered thoroughly, I think. So at this point I'm going to bring some gameplay in the Sherman to show what it can do, and possibly some tips that you can translate over into your games if you find yourself playing this tank. So here we are. The Sherman is being driven for us today by H. Ronnie 1979. I shall be calling them Ron to make things easier. Ron has spawned in the northeastern corner of the Westfield map in a standard game, and they're going to show us just what the Sherman can accomplish. Ron isn't top tier in this game. There are a number of tier 6s on each team, and as you may be able to tell from the minimap, Ron has put everything into view range because their view range circle is as large as it can get. This means Ron has managed to get at least 445 meters view range on their Sherman using equipment, commander skills, directives, and the premium consumable in the bottom there. He's likely been able to do this because of the base view range of the Sherman being 370 meters, as mentioned before. You'll notice as well that they have the 105mm howitzer equipped and have taken predominantly high explosive rounds, which are the only rounds they'll be using in this game. Ron plays extremely well in this game. They don't really put their foot wrong, and while they don't come out with an extraordinary result, they do manage to have a pivotal role in the game and grasp victory from what very easily could have been a defeat. You see here Ron moving up to take their first position in the game, the bush at G0. It's a very strong shooting position for any tank and provides Ron with good spotting opportunities as well. All three friendly Tier 6 light tanks elect to fight for the hill in the southeast. This doesn't go very well for them, as the first one attempts to take on two enemy tanks alone, and Ron is beginning to spot their backup. You see the enemy Tier 6 light tank there hanging back, takes a pot shot, unfortunately misses. It's at this point where the team suffer their first loss, that AMX-12T that elected to go straight in all the way down to the southeastern hill gets caught out by a Skoda T25 who unloads all three shells into him, and he's quickly finished off by the Super Chaffee. The other two light tanks on the friendly side don't move for some bizarre reason until the enemy back off and are unspotted, so it allows them to disengage and stay safe so they can't be shot while they reload. Pretty much everyone on this side takes a pot shot at the Skoda, and it's fairly unlucky that they didn't get killed by that immediate strike, but you'll see not too long after, there we go, it goes down to the friendly Super Chaffee hiding in the bushes. But it does also get him killed as well. Ron finds a lagging behind Panzer 3/4, who's making their way up to the hill to counter the position, and will spot also a KV-1SA who's hanging around at the opposing position to this bush at G0. He does also spot this BDR G1, and I don't really know what to say about this play from the enemy BDR. Apart from that, this guy has balls of steel. They just manifest that there's not 3 enemy tanks shooting at them, plus the tier 6 light in the hill in the southeast, and just drives out in front of all the guns and doesn't really take that much damage for it. It was only Ron that hit them with some splash damage in the side, and Ron gets sidetracked by some tanks on his right, allowing the BDR to move across. Ron actually gets spotted for the first time this game for shooting that VK2801 on the opposite ridge. I don't think the VK was the one that spotted them. I think it was the Panzer IV-H you see there moving through the trees. We're going to give Ron the benefit of the doubt here and assume that they waited until the Panzer IV was then behind trees before they fired again. As you'll see later, Ron is very well aware of the camouflage and spotting mechanics. So even though they're firing the larger gun, the 105mm howitzer, the camouflage rating is even worse when you shoot, but Ron is able to use bushes and fallen trees to make sure they are not spotted after shooting. You can see the game is not going particularly well for Ron's team. They are currently down 3 tanks. They appear to have lost the top half of the map mostly. Only the T-78 remains right in that corner, the last hard point, Ron's position really. You can see Ron holds their fire. They know the Super Chaffee is there. They wait until the Super Chaffee fires, loses the camo, allows them to get the shot off and knock out their first tank of the game. It's at about this point the artillery begins to make a nuisance of itself, especially that French artillery piece. Ron manages to bounce a huge shell from the VK2801, saving him 350 health. The only reason that happened was because of the overmatch mechanic. The VK's gun was too small. I think this shell was a blind shot from the KV-1SA. It was a very good shot, but victory doesn't last very long as it's shortly killed. There's a little bit of a lull in the action here. Ron, desperate to try and reacquire that VK2801 so they could shoot them again and finish them off, returning to his original position so they can spot the BDR, who's been unspotted for a while, as well as the Panzer III/4. The team have pulled back to the deficit a little. They're only 2 tanks behind instead of 3 now. Artillery seems to be just trying to wean out Ron here. I don't see this very often from artillery players, to be fair. But here's the main play. The Panzer III/4 moves immediately, drawing his attention, and Ron shows incredible awareness to spot the BDR, who snuck up through the bushes to try and flank him, and is rewarded by bouncing, essentially, the 90mm shell from the BDR, which would have probably cost him the game, as we're going to see with his remaining health at the end. But the bad news is the BDR has taken this position from him now. So what to do now? The position has been taken by the BDR, full health BDR essentially, and what can you do to save this game? Personally, I would have sat up at the end of that bridge, just passed through the arches, gone back up and tried to proxy spot the BDR or try and draw them out into a crossfire with the Panzer IV-H, but Ron does something arguably better here. They go back a little bit further, knock a few trees down, rack up the camo rating, which allows them to shoot at the BDR without being spotted. This is textbook bushwork, really, and it allows them to get all the free damage off that they can. In hindsight, I believe that this play was probably the one that saved the game, really. It allowed the hit point pools to essentially rebalance. It's at this point the VK2801 appears in the opposite end of the ridge, and Ron obviously spots it as soon as it comes up. He's already looking, you can see, and sees that the BDR is taking fire and elects to immediately, before the BDR is even dead, elects to aim at the VK because the Panzer IV-H on the opposite ridge was shooting him. Therefore, Ron trusted the Panzer IV-H to finish them off while they turned and dealt with the VK2801. Personally, I think it was the right decision for Ron to switch their fire from the BDR to the VK2801, because at the end of the day, you can't really trust your teammates with that much, but you can trust them to shoot the thing, essentially, especially when they're side on. And as we know, because Ron took a 240 damage shell to the side of the turret, they were aiming away from them. So Ron was, in that moment, thinking ahead, how are they going to take out both of the tanks instead of just focusing down the BDR. It would be possible at this stage for the VK2801 to one-shot him with premium ammunition, so it was the correct decision. Now Ron has to think about the last leg of this game. Only one actual tank remains, along with two self-propelled guns, but it is by no means a pushover. This AMX 12T is T6 light tank, probably has the advantage in terms of view range and camo rating combined, because both tanks have decent view range, but the light tank has that advantage of its mobile camo is the same as its stationary camo. You can see Ron has a couple of ideas about where this AMX is going to be. They're trying to direct their last remaining ally, the Panzer IV, up to the opposite ridge, while they take this position here in the south. This is to cover as much of the map as possible with view range from the two remaining tanks on the friendly team. Perhaps a theorised play would be for Ron to wait here until the Panzer IV-H is up on top of the mid-ridge. Then they would rush in straight forwards into the enemy base, try and take out the artillery, while the Panzer IV-H overwatched and put some firepower down. But the Panzer IV-H has their own ideas and elects to go straight in towards the enemy base. This always happens in World of Tanks. The players on your team will do whatever they want to do, and that's completely fine. It may put the game at risk, but at the end of the day, it's a game. But you will see that the Panzer IV-H will take some artillery fire because the AMX-12T is spotting. The AMX-12T is in fact AFK in the base, but has such strong view range that they will be able to pick up the Panzer IV-H and Ron, which will cause him to take a hit from artillery here, because in that small moment Ron was driving along between the trees, so the Sherman had its decreased camo value and there was no obstructed cover between themselves and the AMX-12T AOK in the base. It's likely the 12T was using binoculars or at least coated optics for it to see that far and spot Ron from such a great distance. But because it's AFK, easy pickings for the Panzer IV-H once they get into cover, and now it's just a question of finding the artillery, which is easy enough to do when you've got that mad view range that Ron has. They quickly come up behind the grill and finish them off. You probably noticed there that the remaining French artillery, the AMX-13AM down there, elected to shoot at Ron instead of their teammate down there, the Panzer IV-H, even though they were a closer target and an open flat ground. This artillery piece for some reason has been hassling Ron all game and tried their harder shot to finish them off, which they very well could have done. But it's not going to help them in this situation as Ron comes around the back. Probably revels in this last shot of the game and takes a little bit of time with it, but in the end the result is what the result is, and Ron picks up their 4th kill of the match, earning themselves a Pascucci's medal in the process. So that concludes this battle from Ron in the M4 Sherman, showing us exactly how to use it and use it well. The battle brought them home a Ace Tanker medal, a Pascucci's medal, and another medal that I can't really pronounce for doing 1,879 base damage, as well as 2,170 assistance damage. They spotted 7 enemies and got 4 kills, and made a nice bit of experience as well. It will come as a surprise to absolutely no one that Ron came on top of the team with 1,295 base experience, but commendations to Bazbug in the Panzer IV-H as well. Despite not going to the position Ron suggested, they still managed to pick up 2 kills, get a hefty amount of XP, and finish the game alive, which is more than can be said for the enemy team. And with that, this video comes to a close. Thank you all for watching. I hope you come away with a better understanding of the M4 Sherman and its strengths or weaknesses, and maybe learnt a bit more about its history as well. Thanks to Ron, we saw a masterclass on how to use the tank correctly and what appears to be a very good candidate for setting up the M4 Sherman. If you like this video, consider giving it a like, and if you're interested in this kind of content, then please subscribe. It's the kind of thing I'll be putting out for the foreseeable future. If there's a tank you would want me to review next, please whack it in the comments below. All that said, thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.